Yeah, we're live. Hello, everybody. That was tight to time, wasn't it, Tom? That was tight to time. Yeah, it was close. And obviously waiting for a few people to come in, and we're getting quite large figures. But hello to everybody that's joined us. Welcome to the event Team's Q&A. We decided to go live. It's quite nice. Of course, that means that there'll be comments going in. Just to let you know, if you do comment, that we have Russ Jeffries in the lobby. He'll be overseeing that and keeping tabs on that. And we'll come to that in a second regarding comments. But at the moment, it's about questions. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this lunchtime. We recognise that Friday lunchtime may not be convenient for everybody, but of course, this is going to be published and it's recorded live, and then it goes and it's published for people to watch later on both Facebook and YouTube at your leisure. So, who are we? Well, first off, I'm Danny Norman. I'm athlete number 482. And yeah, who am I? Well, basically, I'm an event director of Surbiton Juniors, 5 years, if you don't already know. A 15-year park runner and 691 park runs at the time of pausing and 336 different park runs. So I've toured around a lot. So that's why I feel very privileged that I've been lent this position in terms of having my experience. But who is Tom? So hello, Tom. Would you care to tell us a little bit about yourself? I think most people watching know by now.
Hello, Danny. Yes, just briefly. So I'm Tom Williams. I'm Global COO of Parkrun, Parkrunner A6013. Started in Bushy Parkrun in August. Then, although I was living in Leeds, started Woodhouse Moor Parkrun, event number 4. And then I've worked for Parkrun since 2011. Doesn't time fly? And here we are.
Yeah, here we are.
Shall I give a brief recap on how we got to this point, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, it's, 7 months now. So trying to digest 7 months into 5. But yeah, go ahead, fire away.
It's a crazy situation, isn't it? So just briefly, as while people join, and just a recap for a few minutes, I've been asked by the regional ambassadors to keep it short this time. So I'll make sure we do that. But just a recap and bring us back up to speed while people join. So obviously we closed down in March. It was an incredibly moving moment. I think none of us had ever expected that there'd be a weekend where there wasn't a park run anywhere in the world. And that point when we pressed the button the second week, so we closed 15 countries, then we closed 7 countries. And the second week when we pressed the button to close it was a incredibly moving and challenging moment, and suddenly we were where we were, and things had moved really, really quickly. From that point, we at that point clearly we knew the world was being impacted in completely different ways, and people within countries, within towns, within families were being impacted in completely different ways. So we set about trying to understand that. So we offered phone calls to all the event teams and ambassadors around the world, over 2,000, and we rang over 1,000 who took us up on the offer of the calls. During that time, we've done extensive survey work. We've spoken to event teams and volunteers, and of course amongst the staff, with stakeholders and landowners and sponsors and so on, and all the way through. And it's been an incredible journey, really. And here we are today. We have about 30 parkrun events live in the world. We have some more events starting this weekend. We hope to be back up to 100 events a week by the end of October, which globally, which would be fantastic. This is a UK specific conversation, and there's a number of reasons why we felt it was right to have or helpful to have a UK specific conversation. In fact, the questions we get asked are largely the same around the world. The concerns, the challenges, and again, are largely the same around the world as we've been, parkrun in Russia or America or Singapore or Japan or Australia or South Africa, wherever it is. I think the reason why parkrun works is because we have more in common than we have different around the world, and that goes for in good times when parkrun's going really, really well, and it goes for now in challenging times when things are difficult. We did, as people will know, at the beginning of September, we announced that we intended to reopen parkrun in England towards the end of October, which went down incredibly positively for about a day, and then the world changed and turned. And we can talk, whether that comes up in the questions or not, I don't know, but we can talk about that if needed. We then, a couple of weeks ago, unfortunately, we were in a position where we took the decision to not intend to reopen towards the end of October. That was an England-only decision at the time because regulations allowed us to, and government guidelines and public health nationally allowed us to, in England, but not into Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, or Ireland. But in the UK, we have around about 1,100 or 1,200 events across UK and Ireland, maybe 1,300 including Ireland. And we have about 1,500 event directors. And those events are existing communities where up until October, beginning of September, things were improving incredibly. Or all the metrics you looked at, whether you looked at hospitalizations or illness by other measures or sadly deaths, whether you looked at infection levels, whether it was positive tests or whether it was estimates by ONS, everything was moving in a really positive direction until September. It was, schools were due to come back. Obviously they did. They've come back quite well, of course. Universities were due to come back. They did. That's not gone so well. And sports crowds, particularly football crowds, which are very visible, were due to come back, and they haven't at all. So over the last kind of 6 weeks, things have changed dramatically. And as a result of that, there's a lot of confusion in the UK in general, and with regards to parkrun. And so we felt we would put on this Q&A specifically for UK event teams. It's one of many ways we've tried to engage from a communications perspective across the last 6 or 7 months, and will continue to do going forwards. So this isn't by any means the only opportunity or a one-off opportunity. But the way we did this is that we wrote to the event teams, all UK event teams, and provided a form for them to submit questions. And then those questions were submitted to the regional ambassadors. And the regional ambassadors, which is a group of about 40 really experienced volunteers in the UK representing Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland and England. And they took those questions on board, and we asked them to put the questions to us to best represent the event teams. So Danny's going to talk through the process in a moment of how this Q&A is going to go, the format of it. Mm-hmm. What we've tried to do is as a leadership team in the charity is take a bit of a step back and hand that process of what the questions are and the format they're asked over to the regional ambassadors who have selected these questions from the questions submitted as what they think are the most representative, most important, most commonly asked questions that they feel it would be helpful for us to address. One of the other things that I alluded to earlier was that the regional ambassadors asked that we do something shorter this time. So the last Q&A that Nick and I did was 2.5 hours.
Well, you're 5 minutes to 10 minutes nearly at the moment. So
no, we started late. I'm nearly done. So the regionals asked if we keep it shorter, keep it closer to an hour, maybe an hour and a half, to make it more digestible, but that we ask further questions, answer further questions and further Q&A. So there will be subsequent opportunities to this where we explore different topics, guided by the regional ambassadors based on the questions they've received in from the parkrun event community. So here we are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it explains it quite well, actually. So the aim here, and it's the way I position myself, I want to represent and remain as impartial as I can be. So, of course, if you answer a question and I maybe want to challenge that, then I'm allowed to, and feel free to do so. And again, this is another benefit of you guys saying, look, we're trying to be as open and honest as we possibly can. I will question you further if there's more to be asked. And then the aim is to be around an hour. I think we've already gone through 10 minutes. So Tom's 5 is 10. This could be 2 hours. Who knows? We'll try and keep it short and digestible. And but like you said, yeah, fear not if the questions aren't asked and covered and that you want it to be. And this, as you say, won't be the last Q&A. We can do this repeatedly. Of course, again, have the same questions keep on maybe appearing, or there could be new ones along the way, and having to continually for people. And Tom has gone. He's given up. All right.
Just closing the window because that's freezing.
So yeah, in the interim, guys, if you are watching this and you have any additional questions that we don't address, and please feel free to reach out to HQ. They're always saying that to you. They will call you, they will speak to you, they will email you. I mean, your ambassadors are there. They're there to help you out. There's the support network. Parkrun is a big community, and they're there to try and help you out. And so, of course, they're always making sure that if you do have questions, queries, you can hopefully find the answer. So primarily focused on having a conversation between you and I, Tom. So I won't be looking at the comments. I can see the comments are coming in. And of course, don't want to be distracted. So I want to really try and focus and pay attention to you when you give the responses. And the chosen questions. So we've placed them into categories. So firstly, the biggest area, of course, is volunteer concerns. That's going to be the one. A lot of concerns that volunteers have, rather than, we'll have the additional things later on. We've got event independence, hygiene matters, and public perception. So those matters will be addressed later on too. And I've also got a hard copy of this. It's a lot easier to have a hard copy of all this information rather than it is reading on the screen, because otherwise I'll lend my face in too close. You don't want me imposingly too close to the screen in the microphone. So please comment. And if there is anything pertinent, Russ again is in the lobby. We'll try and bring it up with us and addressing anything that may need to be raised. So again, clarity and transparency regarding this. 194 questions came in total from 71 events. And these were, as you said, Tom, collated by regional ambassadors from all over the UK. So that's a fair sort of proportion. I guess there's quite a lot of questions coming in. And they were chosen specifically to be asked by the ambassadors, as you've mentioned. I've read all 194. You've read all 194 too. Is that correct, Tom? So we've gauged the general feeling of what people are worrying about and asking what their concerns are, what they would like to be answered. And this is, of course, from the EDs, RDs. RDs have been questions asked on their behalf by ambassadors as well as event directors. So it's not just one person per event. Of course, you've got co-EDs across the board. And so that's where we are. That's where we're positioning ourselves. So shall we roll into the first question, Tom?
Yeah, great.
I've even done this little bit. This is a little fancy bit. Here we go. I've got a little subheading, so that would be nice and shiny at the bottom there. So volunteer concerns. Now, this is a sizable one, but I think you've got it there with you as well. Is that correct, Tom? Just in case you need to refer to it. And they've been asked, this is the one and only, but the person asking this has asked to remain anonymous, as of course we're obliging that. The question goes, how many event directors are concerned over reopening plans compared to those who are happy to proceed? Was I in the minority to have been overly concerned? When the announcement to go ahead happened, my anxiety levels went through the roof and the sleepless nights came with it. Only when the announcement of the postponement happened did my sleeping pattern begin to return to normal again. I realise that you are trying to balance the needs of all, but when the return is announced, can the specific plans that are required for any restart be communicated at the time, rather than saying no need to do anything yet, as the longer the expectations are left, the less time there is to put the necessary plans into place and the anxiety levels increase as we do our best to get things right. The added responsibility that we have is a privilege and we want to get it right for everyone. So a fairly sizable question. So over to you, Tom.
Yeah, so I think it's a really important question. And just to reiterate, the regional ambassadors looked at the questions, had free rein to choose any they want and prioritise the ones they wanted, and they felt this was the most important one to address first. I would agree with that, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that we're not influencing what the questions are or the order they're in. And look, I think most importantly, really most importantly, I'm really sorry that you feel like that, and or the park run has made you feel like that. I think we've always believed that parkrun should enhance everybody's life, whether you're an event director, a run director, a core volunteer, or you turn up once a year to walk around or run around. And it, you know, for all of us, probably for any park runner that park runs for a number of years, there are times when it's not like that, and it causes you anxiety in a number of different ways. And that's always been something that we found really difficult, because we think parkrun is about making people healthier and happier. And you know, whether you're whether you're an event director or an occasional runner, we would want that to be the case. So I'm really sorry that parkrun has led people, and I'm sure you're not the only one, has led people, well, I mean, I know you're not the only one, but has led people to feel like that. Please do reach out. So if you're listening to this, if anybody is listening to this and they feel that, not just during COVID-19 and the challenges that that's presented, but if you feel at any point that parkrun is causing you any level of anxiety or stress, please do reach out, and we have an incredible team here to help. And if we haven't made that clear enough, I'd also apologise for that. If we haven't made it clear enough that we are always there. So event teams, whoever you are, as a runner, an event director, a run director, whoever it might be, you can reach out through directly via email or through the website or through the ambassador. And we have a great team there to support. So Helen Hood, our head of event delivery, has been an ED at Collett Parkrun, is still an event director at Collett Parkrun, has been for nearly 10 years and has volunteered over 500 times. Josinton Hewitt was a volunteer pioneer at Parkrun #1 in 2004 and has supported Parkrun teams first as a volunteer and then as a staff member for 16 years. And those two lead a wider team, and everybody is incredibly passionate about trying to support the fact that Parkrun should make every single person healthier and happier, whatever their role and engagement in Parkrun. So please reach out if you're in those situations. And I myself have been making phone calls, Helen and Joe and the wider team, and everybody's involved in that. And that's so important. And I think we could have been clear. We could have been clearer about that. We could have been clearer about please reach out if you're feeling anxiety at any point. I think we also possibly could have been clearer about there's nothing to do right now. So the reason why we announced an intent to return at the end of October, which at the time was about 8 to 9 weeks away, I think, from when we first made the announcement, I think on the 5th of September. We wanted to make the announcement as soon as possible so we could have the discussion, but we knew there was a lot of work to do between an announcement of we'd like to return by the end of October and we are returning on this date, be it the 24th or the 31st, and obviously that didn't materialise. We did specifically try and present it as an intent to return with much work ahead of us, and nothing to do for event teams at that point. You know, Helen, as I say, our head of event delivery is an event director. My wife's an event director. We have a number of people on the team who are aware event directors and so on. So we understand that many event directors will want to do more proactively and do as much as they can and be supportive and will be fielding questions. But at the time, we tried to make that announcement as early as we could to give people as much notice as possible. But the fact that we did it so early meant that there was nothing for event teams to do at that time. I think also importantly, there isn't and there never will be an obligation for any Parkrun volunteer to do anything. So we would never put ourselves in a position where, as a Parkrun volunteer, you have to do X, Y, or Z. There's always a conversation about that as to whether a volunteer can say, I don't feel comfortable with this. Can we talk about it? Of course we can. Sometimes we get.
Can I ask something there, Tom? Sorry to interrupt. Can I ask something, which is, of course, I want to recognise the fact that people may question that, because, of course, there is that disagreement about the mandatory thing. Of course, the interpretations there, and then that's the thing in terms of. I think you've already addressed that, though. I think you said you could have communicated a bit better, or maybe the choice of the language. Would that be part of that? The fact that mandatory kind of gave the impression that you have to do this?
Yeah, look, I think we've removed the term mandatory from the FAQs, actually. Okay. I think if you search for the word mandatory in FAQs, that word is gone. It is, in reflection, that's a maybe divisive is the wrong term, but like a provocative word. Yeah. I think what we all need to do is separate the events from ourselves, or Parkrun from ourselves. And so and we'll come to this, I think, later in some of the questions around events coming back and whose decision is that and how does that work. I think there is no requirement on any volunteer, or any individual, to do anything. So if there's something somebody doesn't feel comfortable about, they don't need to do it. I'd always urge them to contact us, and we'll talk through it at great length. I've had a load of phone calls myself with people over the last few months, and the team have. Sometimes you do get to that position where we think, actually, Parkrun, the charity, the organisation, thinks that A is the right thing to do, and a volunteer thinks that A isn't the right thing to do. And where we have that difference of opinion, sometimes we have to say, we have to make the decision for Parkrun. So Parkrun is going to do this. And if you don't feel comfortable supporting that decision at the moment, we totally respect that. But I think it is important to understand that there isn't an obligation on a volunteer to them personally to do anything themselves. There was a question there, I think, around were they in the minority, and I think yes. Certainly at the time, Probably still. And that my justification for that, so my evidence for that would be that for about 9 weeks leading up to that point, for about 3 months now, we've surveyed a sample of park runners every single week. And we asked them a whole load of questions, in terms of what are your concerns relating to COVID? Would you come back and volunteer? Would you come back and run and so on? And when might you do that? And all those kind of things. Actually, right from the beginning of June, the majority of people, be they volunteers or walkers or runners, have expressed a desire to return. Throughout, of course, there's been a minority, sometimes a larger minority, sometimes a smaller minority, not so keen. Over those weeks up to the point of announcement of a return, by the time we got to that point, there was about 80% of people were saying that they'd be really keen to come back. And about 7% of people were saying they would be unlikely to come back, how they felt at that time. And the rest were in the middle. What we found was that was pretty representative when we spoke to event teams directly, when we drilled down by people volunteering, when we spoke to landowners, and actually there was, for example, we called directly the 11 largest teams in the UK to try and understand the challenges they were facing as the largest teams. They're delivering events to often over 1,000 people, and there are pressures there. And that kind of, roughly 4/5 being really comfortable with a return, of course, with questions and so on. And then the remaining 5th being split between maybe and definitely not. That was representative when we call the bigger teams and when we speak to teams day to day and so on. And so I do think I'm pretty confident that that's reflective of the wider community. And so we would have expected, had we asked all the event teams what they felt about that, I think we'd have got similar answers. The challenge with actually asking event teams, because people would say, well, why don't you ask event teams? The challenge with asking specifically event teams is if you just write to the event directors, the event inbox, you don't always get an incredible response necessarily, and actually often get the response of a person. So you try and widen it to a core team, and then defining a core team is tricky. So when we send out the volunteer update, I think we send it to all volunteers now. We used to send it to people who'd run directed once in the last 6 months or something, but it starts to get really complicated. And actually our survey that goes out to 20,000 park runners every Friday includes event directors. I mean, I got it once. In fact, my wife's got it once, and it's a random selection of 20,000 people who've walked, jogged, run, or volunteered once in the 12 months up to lockdown. And so actually that does include all aspects of parkrun. At some point in the future, and this is probably the longest question, but I think it's the most important question, and there's lots of good points to it. So
this is the thing, just to say, of course, it's a big question. There's a lot to say, but the questions, they do get a bit smaller and a bit more brief in the responses. So,
yes. Yeah, there's a lot to this, but it's very important, and we specifically wanted to address, or the regional ambassadors wanted to address the entire the entire question. I think at some point in the future we'll be back. We will be back. So there was a part of that question around next time. There was a point in the future where we'll be back. Clearly, we've learned an incredible amount from that process. And actually getting approvals, I think we'll talk about approvals later, but getting approvals for 1,300 locations, well, that would be UK and Ireland, but 850 locations in England is a really complex thing. And I think some of the things we've learned in differences between national and local public health. So we worked incredibly closely with the Deputy Chief Medical Officer and DCMS and Sport England support those conversations. I mean, incredibly closely, going through the framework with a fine tooth comb, achieve national public health sign-off at that level, that the way we intend to deliver parkrun is appropriate for the parkrun environment for the UK at that time. Remember, things changed quite dramatically from that. We had it approved on September the 4th, I think, announced on the 6th, 7th, and then things changed quite dramatically after that. So you put it in that context. But actually what we found is there were big differences actually between how local public health received framework and how national public health had received the framework, which we had and we hadn't expected, but it definitely caught us off guard a little bit. There were also confusions around clarity with government guidelines. So partly how they're written, so the guidelines relating to events, outdoor events. And I think the guidelines themselves could have been written clearly, so I understand some of the confusion. At the same time, again, some confusion at local level with regards to what the guidelines really were. And so we'll definitely be looking at trying to do a better job of tying up some of those loose ends prior to an announcement of going forwards. I think we've seen similarities with schools, universities, going back, and then there being confusions at local levels. We have, and these are just some of the lessons we've learned in terms of when we come to this position again of announcing a reopening or being in a position to reopen, what have we learned and what will we do? It's really challenging if multiple stakeholders at local level have the complete power of veto. So if let's take England, 850 English events, if every ED has the power to say no, every landowner has the power to say no, every land manager has the power to say no, every local public health director has the power to say no, every local core team, every local authority, suddenly you have to get completely unanimous position amongst a large number of stakeholders at every single local point. That's almost an impossible task to achieve. Not that we would have to go with 100% of events reopening, but there are obvious issues if you have a couple of big events not opening next to a couple of small events, for example, or a couple of big events in England opening right next to Wales if Wales was in lockdown. So there's some challenges there. Sport England, in an England context, Sport England have been incredible in supporting some of those conversations from over the last couple of months. Conversations are ongoing with, for example, the local government association who represent the local authorities. We've all the way through been in conversations with the likes of Forestry England and National Trust. At the same time, a lot of national organisations, a lot of national bodies, committees, are so busy with so many things that are rightly much more important than parkrun. Getting time with those bodies is difficult. So, for example, recently we had a really excellent meeting with the Return to Sport Expert Committee, I think is the title, for Northern Ireland. We had a really, really great meeting with a number of their representatives, so medical representatives and so on. And it was really, really positive. And actually announcing an intent to return, creating a framework, publishing a framework allows some of those conversations to happen in a way they might not otherwise. Clearly, with 1,100 UK events, there needs to be a level of top-down approach. When we saw the return of grassroots football, which is 2 million footballers, I think, something like 2,000 leagues across England, that was. It was announced that football was coming back, and football kind of came back. And I'm sure there were some local conversations, but it wasn't up for each local football team or each local football league to achieve permission one at a time at that time. That was much more of a top-down thing. The same with gyms reopening. Of course, they have to have their own risk assessments and all those kind of things and operate within probably, I'm guessing, a UK active framework or something like that. Actually, that central sign-off allowed gyms to open and the central sign-off allowed football to reopen. And we, as parkrun and reopening parkrun in the UK, we definitely need to do that. Russ is telling me off in the comments. But of course, we will still look to communicate as early as we can and as transparently as we can. So I think we've always taken the decision to communicate as much as we know, as soon as we know it, which does end up sometimes with people saying, well, hang on a minute, what does that mean for us? But that we feel that's better than saying, right, here's the framework, here's the date, you've got 3 weeks to go, let's go, and catching everybody by surprise. Hopefully we've answered that. It was a really important question. If you wrote that question, feel free to reach out directly. If that question resonates with you, feel free to reach out directly. But if you're feeling anxious, please do reach out. We're here to help.
I mean, I don't want to string out the question too much, but in terms of a couple of points that you said there that I would want to bring up, you said that you didn't feel that many people were anxious, but of course I knew people locally. Obviously, that doesn't reflect everybody, but I certainly could name you a few. So of course, it's like I'm aware that there was anxieties.
Well, I think lots are, Danny, but I think it's a minority, and that doesn't devalue it at all.
No,
I think that the number of people anxious of parkrun returning is a significant minority of people, and that doesn't, certainly from all our phone calls and our surveys and all of our work, that it bears that out.
Well, yeah, there's a proportion, but yeah, I mean, let's say there's a lot of Yeah, it's interesting to gauge. Of course, people will be watching going, well, I'm in the minority, but yeah, it's like I don't like being pigeonholed to that sense. And yeah, no, I get and I respect entirely what you say. And the football thing as well. I mean, I personally, it's interesting you said that because I didn't know that about the football. Because of course, I've been vocal on Twitter about how is it footballers can go about and do this, and of course, spectators standing close to each other in that outdoor capacity. We've gone over with the whole thing that it's like, well, they're close to each other, whereas parkrunners would have that time together less. But they've got permissions. They have permissions from the top down, which has helped. So, of course, this is important when it comes to the parkrun side of things. So I didn't know about that. So thank you for adding that piece of information in. Right, next question, okay? Let's see if we can, this one will be a bit shorter, I promise you. Janice Clement, Run Director, Springburn Parkrun. That's up in Glasgow, if I'm not mistaken, because I've been there. I've been fortunate enough to go up there and run their event. What happens if part of an event team wants parkrun back at the earliest opportunity, but other members don't? And similar questions were asked by Jill Richardson from Mark Eaton, Tim and May Glover Pulteney in Winchester Juniors, Kerry Green, Gloucester North, Joe Lloyd at Queen's Parade Juniors. So that's a question that's been asked quite frequently.
Yeah, it's a very common question. One of the most common questions, probably. To refer back to a little bit to earlier, there's no obligation for any volunteer, any individual volunteer to do anything themselves. Whenever any volunteer feels uncomfortable, they should reach out, and particularly where there's especially where there's maybe a disagreement or a difference of opinion within an event team, and you've got two people think, yeah, it's great, let's go for it, and three people really concerned, or however that may be, please reach out. I think the context for that is that the parkrun charity is ultimately responsible for two things: ensuring events are delivered safely, and delivering on its objects to improve the health and well-being of local communities through the provision of walking and running and volunteering events. And the charity itself and has a legal obligation to deliver on those two things, to make sure parkrun events are delivered safely and to make sure that it's delivering on the objects of making the world a healthier and happier place. And that responsibility stops and starts with the charity, Parkrun Global Limited, the charity that oversees all parkrun events. And so, for example, as part of that, where parkrun events are closed right now, parkrun event teams don't have the autonomy, the ability to reopen their events if they think it's safe. So if right now we had an event somewhere where the event team were happy to go, and the landowner was going to give them permission, and maybe if there's a local director of public health, they were happy with it. And there will be scenarios like that. Of course, they would be in the minority, but there are scenarios like that. We as the charity would say, no, you can't start because we don't think at this moment in time it's appropriate or appropriately safe, or safe, or however you want to use those terms. And so we have a legal requirement, an obligation, a moral duty to keep events safe, and that can include not allowing event teams to decide when they reopen their events if we think it's not time yet, if we think it's not safe. And at the same time, we also have a responsibility delivering on our objects to make the decision as to whether we think it is safe for events to return in a local region. And I think, really importantly, there are kind of 3 points there. So one, we would need to think it was appropriate for parkrun events to return. And in fact, there are situations where we take the decision that actually legally we could open parkrun. Even right now, we had a meeting about it this morning. I'm not sure what's been published yet, so I'm not going to make any announcements on here, but where legally we can deliver parkrun events in a certain region, but actually we take the decision we don't think it's right, even though we could legally do it, and we've got permission and the volunteers are willing to do it. And so we might overrule that. So we have a decision to make as a charity. Do we think it's appropriate? We don't just say we always think it's appropriate if we legally can. Local landowners always, in every parkrun event anywhere in the world, the local landowner always has done and always will have the right of veto over a parkrun, saying, I don't want a parkrun on my piece of land. And they have that right 52 weeks of the year, forever. It's their land, they own it. So they have the ability to say that we would never, obviously, deliver an event where that was not the case, where a landowner wasn't happy with us being there.
Well, Little Stoke is a prime example of that, for example.
Little Stoke's a prime example, exactly right. Okay. And then certainly in the UK, in most situations in the UK, it's not the same globally, most situations in the UK, there'd be local public health. In the UK, we have directors of public health. And again, if they're not comfortable with a level of safety, they would rightly, again, they would be saying this isn't appropriate in this community for these public health reasons, and they can shut down, just like they could shut down something else, they can shut down a parkrun. There's also, of course, so those are two really, really important things. So do we think it's appropriate, and is the landowner, and including a public health director if there is one, or an equivalent, do they think it's safe? There's also behind that a community of park runners who would like a park run to happen. And, so at the point of where we announced the return, it was about 80% of park runners. And of course, there was a little bit of variation across the country, less than you'd think, actually. But actually, if you had a park run with 10,000 people registered there, which isn't remotely uncommon, Bushy has 45,000 people registered there. A park run with 10,000 people registered there, roughly 8,000 would be keen to come back. So if you're in a situation where actually we think it's safe and appropriate, the benefits outweigh the risks, the landowners agree and are willing to accept us, public health agree, and 8,000 people want to park run, I don't think it would be right for, and it would entirely be right for an event director or a group of event directors or a core team to say we don't want to be involved in that. But I don't think it would be right at that point for event directors to say no and stop a park run coming back, stop a park run event coming back in the face of all those situations. However, it would never be as black and white as that. So we would go into, and again, it comes back to the please do reach out to us where you're concerned. We would go into all of those discussions and concerns with local event teams where we would sit there for hours and hours and hours if we needed to, listening and discussing and talking about situations as to why a local event team might think it's not appropriate for their event to come back. Ultimately, we may agree, we may not. The ultimate decision legally has to be with us as a charity. Really importantly, I guess final point on this question is some people will never think it's appropriate, and that's fine. I completely respect their desire to do that. But if we have Harrogate Juniors, my local park run here, where my wife's the event director, if she felt it was never going to be safe to have group gatherings of parents and families in a park, it clearly wouldn't be right if Harrogate Junior Park Run never came back because my wife felt it wasn't safe. Now, she doesn't have to come back as an event director, but actually if the community said we'd like Harrogate Junior Park Run to come back, we have permission, then it would be right that the local community were able to take Harrogate Junior Park Run forwards.
You're never going to get 100% consensus. Of course, if you had to wait for that, then it's never going to return at all whatsoever. It's tricky, isn't it? Because, of course, from my point of view as an event director, it's that realization that, and I was going to stand down after 5 years, is that the event will function without me. Somebody will come along and pick up the mantle and carry it on. And so it's a tricky position. Of course, it's down to choice. And my choice is being, well, I was going to stand down and then move away. Whereas the other people, like, I feel like I'm having to move because I disagree. So, of course, that's that tricky part, isn't it? The fact is the event could and can carry on because there are other people who are willing and disagreeing with that. So I think it's safe to carry on. And that's where I think it's really a difficult balance, because of course you want to appease and appreciate the volunteer or ED who's been doing this and said, I don't feel it's appropriate, but at the same point, it's not reflective of everybody within that particular environment and the community, I should say. And yeah, I don't envy that thing, trying to do what parkrun, which is doing it here, is trying to please all the people all the time, because it's impossible. It's an impossible task. But you've got to go with the majority. Personally, I agree. I absolutely feel that if it's beneficial for everybody and most people want it to come back, and of course the data suggests that, and then fire away. Anyway, so, yeah, thank you.
But Danny, sorry to just interrupt, but we don't quite always go with the majority. So the majority are important. The minority are also really, really important. And actually, you know, when we made the decision to postpone the return of parkrun in England, for example, the large majority of English parkrunners wanted to come back. We still technically had sign-off at national public health and government level. And actually, whilst I think the guidelines are ambiguous enough that people may dispute them, you know, our close discussions with the government show to us that technically we could have come back. So we made the decision to not come back, despite the majority of people wanting to come back, because we felt it wasn't appropriate at that time, and things had changed between the whatever it was, the 4th of September and then whenever it was. And so the majority are always really important, an example there, but the minority are just as important.
Yeah, my apologies. I don't want to. Yes, I didn't want to imply that majority rule is correct every time. Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. Of course, some people who may have concerns that may not be shared, and they may be the right thing and the right one to have as well. So sorry. Yeah, thank you, Tom, for correcting me on that as well. So Ben Wickham, event director, Hackney Marshes. Ben, of course, I'm going to give an anecdote for almost every one of these events I've been to or run with these people, but I've run with Ben. It's strongly felt within my team that the framework for parkrun returning prioritises parkrun running participants at the expense of volunteers, meaning volunteers are likely to have a high degree of contact with multiple people. We've had it represented to us that many of our regular volunteers will not return under this framework, and we need more, not less, to make it work. How can you address that?
Thanks, Ben. I think, again, this is very common in the way that everybody's affected differently. So some people, the last 6 months have been a really good time in their lives, and they've relaxed, they've not had stresses, and life's been great. And some people have had the most incredibly challenging 6 months that you could imagine, and everything in between. And manifesting out of that is different levels of anxiety and stress, and different responses to the situation, and different levels of comfort. Even my mum and my dad take very different positions. Both as people in their mid to late 70s have entirely different positions on what's safe, what isn't, how they shouldn't, and so on. And both are equally valid. I think, and so this kind of thing is very common with a number of people saying, actually, I don't feel comfortable coming back. I think we do need to put this in the context of, it's really important to remember, we're not trying to come back right now. And when we were looking at coming back, we were looking at coming back at a time when the world in the UK was very different how it is now. And actually for the 10 weeks previously, every single metric had tracked in the right direction. And the likes of the Deputy Chief Medical Officer who I was speaking to, felt like at that point it was going to continue to a certain level that way. We're not in that world now. And so if people are anxious now, it's very different to people being anxious maybe 2 months ago, but it's all valid. Mm-hmm. I think I disagree that volunteers would have significantly disproportionately increased degree of contact with multiple people. When we think through the parkrun operating model, there are most of the volunteer roles are very easily to social distance, whereas if you were running 27 minutes in a busy parkrun, it would be impossible. But if you're marshalling on this corner, or you're tail walker on a one lapper, or you're doing the run briefing and you're stood back, or you're doing the timekeeping and you're stood back, I think there are a lot of volunteer roles that are quite comfortable to socially distance. Some roles clearly aren't. If you're the funnel manager at a junior parkrun, that would be difficult. Or if you're scanning, people have got to come within a distance to you. Although again, we were looking at having compulsory distance there and change the app and so on. So I think I'm not sure I agree that the volunteers were exposed to a higher level of human interaction. And I think certainly there were plenty of volunteer roles where they definitely didn't have to. I think the first time round we went through the framework really closely, like piece by piece, like I say, with the Deputy Chief Medical Officers, both who are in park runners, with DCMS, with Sport England, and our internal advisors, doctors that we speak to, our staff, and everybody felt really comfortable that there wasn't a volunteer role that was that presented. And we went through every single individual volunteer role, looking at them all. There wasn't a volunteer role that presented a really, really unreasonable level of risk. Now, some of the obvious ones, giving out tokens, and we talked about that a lot internally, and scanning, and we talked about that a lot internally. But actually, we didn't feel that was the case. However, clearly people will feel concerned about that. Lots of people would feel really anxious scanning or handing out tokens, for example. I think second time around we'll attempt to work closer with local public health, so more with local than national public health, to try and help support that position. So one, to get to a position where local public health are comfortable with that, and two, that local public health are able to communicate their comfortableness with it. I think that's really important. We must also remember that at the time when we talked about reopening, there was about 1 in 2,000 people in England, I think, was thought to be infected with a virus. So at an average parkrun event size of 200 people, there'd be, and I know there's regional variation and so on, but averaging the whole thing out, you've got a 1 in 10 chance of there being one person at your parkrun with the virus. And we know, and we are trying to support research specifically into this, and we supported some research that's already been published. We know that evidence suggests even if you live with somebody with the virus throughout the period of their infection, you're unlikely to give it to them. And so actually, the chances of you contracting the virus from somebody, from the 1 in 10 chance that there's one person at your park run and you drop a token in their hand, the chances of you contracting the virus, we feel, are incredibly small. Now, we know that's not evidenced. We're trying to support evidence to show that kind of stuff. Over the last 7 weeks or 6 weeks, the incidence of the virus in the community has gone from something like 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 200 in England. And because of that and many other things, we're choosing not to return. And so when you put that, the original question talked about a high degree of contact with multiple people. When you put it in the context of 1 in 2,000 people have got the virus, and actually at the time that had gone down for 10 consecutive weeks or something, the chances of you coming in contact with one person, let alone multiple people, let alone for an extended period of time, is incredibly small. And at the point where we return, we would be making those same judgments.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So just to refer back very briefly to what you said at the end there about people living with somebody and may not get that. I had this conversation. I had a run this morning, and I was chatting away. My uncle had it at the early stages. April was hospitalised. Actually, he was put on. I keep getting the name wrong of the ventilator. Sorry, he was put on the ventilator. He was hospitalised in there for a few weeks. My auntie was having to do without it, but of course she never got it. So of course you have these anecdotal pieces of evidence of them, people not getting it, even living.
There's quite robust scientific evidence. So if people search the evidence, there's quite robust evidence around transmission rates in households where, families of 2 people in a family have had it and 2 haven't, or whatever it is. And it's less than, I think even if you're married to somebody, the science is suggesting, I can't remember, 25 to 50% chance. Like if you're married to them, so you really are sharing a whole load of stuff there. So, when you then put that into the context of a park run setting, and if you're scanning people and you're timing people or whatever it is, it starts to, I think, in our opinion, paint a pretty safe picture.
Yeah, fair enough. Right, next question. Martin Kay, event director from Sharpen Road Playing Fields. Is this one of these new ones that's been waiting? So I have not heard. I think it might be one of the new ones that's waiting to go. Parkrun's onboarding is totally focused on the event participants, but we are going to need lots of extra volunteers to deliver events now. We urgently need a place where new volunteers who can't or don't want to run, but are happy to do marshalling, scanning, etc., can sign up to do so. Could there be a registration page that outlines the various roles and the benefits of volunteering alongside a more relevant registration form, perhaps in place before the relaunch? And similar was asked by Michael Shaw from Hunstanton Promenade and Chris Raveney at Burgess. So that I found that question really quite interesting, fascinating, that one. Could that be the case?
Yeah, a really interesting question. I think, so the truth is we won't know till we come back how people really actually feel about volunteering. And as we've reopened territory, so we've reopened parts of Australia, all of New Zealand, we're about to open Japan, for example. We've been doing survey work beforehand, saying, how do you feel about volunteering? How do you feel about running? And then we can see when they come back how they actually behave. And it's starting to build a picture for us in terms of, okay, if this number of people say they're going to volunteer, this is the number who actually do volunteer. So far, what we've found, and we've only really opened in countries that haven't been significantly impacted by coronavirus, but so far what we found is that events have picked up largely from where they left off in terms of walkers and runners and volunteers and genders and abilities and ages. And we've analysed that quite carefully, with the caveat that these are largely in communities that haven't been massively impacted. I think there shouldn't be a particular increase in volunteers outside of the scanner role. And I think I'm pretty confident in that. And there are clearly some things where there might need to be a few more volunteers, but I don't believe there's a mandated increase in volunteer requirement outside of the scanner role. In the scanner role, we've clearly mandated that it's a scanner per 50 people. And that is partly to I think, was it Ben's question earlier about the contact with park runners. I think, if you're scanning 300 people or you're scanning 30 people, clearly there's a big difference between the number of people you are coming into contact with, albeit that contact is fleeting at best. we actually ran the numbers recently. We looked at what was the average attendance at every parkrun in the world in 2019. How many people did they have scanning on average throughout 2019? And then we were able to divide the number of walkers and runners by the number of scanners, and look at an average of how many walkers and runners there were per scanner for every single event. And we've got that listed for every single event. And then we were able to say, okay, based on their average attendance, how many scanners would they need under the COVID framework? So if they've got 400 people, they would need 8 scanners. And if they already had 4 scanners on average, that means on average they'd need 4 more people scanning a week. Actually, what we found was, and I genuinely don't have these numbers right in front of me, I should have done, about a third of event teams already exceeded the number of scanners they needed. So for example, a junior park run with 100 finishers might have had 3 people scanning. So about a third of all teams globally didn't, maybe this was UK, it might have been UK. Anyway, actually had 1 more scanner they needed. And then another big chunk of teams had the right number. And I think by adding 1 scanner to another chunk of teams, I think we got over half the teams. I think, and I am doing this off the top of my head, I think we had about 55% of teams would be covered if about half of them added 1 more person scanning.
Okay.
Over 90% of teams could be covered by adding, I think it was 4 or 5 people scanning. And that was all they needed, and that was 95% of teams. And remember, that requirement is based on size, so it's directly related to the pool you can draw from. There was a couple of teams that were outliers where they needed a significantly larger number of scanners. Now, actually, they were by definition the biggest teams, and actually they had by a long, long way the most people, being the most finishers per person scanning in 2019. And so you could argue, I'm not criticizing anybody, but you could argue that they were understaffed, under-volunteered, as it were, in terms of scanners previously to it. But actually, on average, we needed to increase the number of people scanning by something like 2.4 people per event across events, and that was all that was needed. So I don't think there's a huge increase in need. I do think there'll be a number of people who don't feel comfortable coming back volunteering. Our intent to return insight, which we ask every Friday, suggests that, and it's a complicated question, because if you don't want to volunteer, why is it? Is it because you're running? And the majority of people who say, actually, I don't want to volunteer when I come back, it's because they want to run, and we've asked those questions. Our feeling is there'll be many more people wanting to volunteer post-COVID as pre-COVID, and as all part of the community spirit we've all found, which is wonderful. And also our comms will be very, very strongly, we need you to volunteer, we need you to volunteer. And last point on that, I guess, all the countries that have opened so far, it's only 2 or 3, but they're all delivering the parkrun framework as you would have to in the UK. And at the moment, it's working well in other countries.
Okay, thank you. Another very conclusive answer. I think a lot of stuff that you said in the past, we'll cover some of these as well. So, for example, this one from Alan Williams, Run Director at Mark Eaton. How will parkrun approach resolving different views on restarting, if and or when there are different opinions between Parkrun HQ, the local event team, and the landowner? And similar to Sophie McKay at Wimbledon, I think it's safe to say we've already addressed that sort of question earlier and regarding that. David Murphy, Event Director, Tees Barrage. The framework talks of parkrun providing an extra support for the volunteers. What will this support entail?
Yeah, so thank you, David. That's a very good question. I think there was, so the rubbish answer to that is whatever's needed, and that's a terrible answer, and it's kind of a politician's answer. We'll do whatever it takes. We'll move heaven and earth to make sure we've got enough volunteers.
World-beating support.
Yeah. I think where we were, and up to the point of announcing the reopening or the intent to reopen at the beginning of September for the end of October, was over those 6 or 8 weeks, the process of, okay, bringing event teams back, understanding the challenges, getting events to fill up their rosters, finding out where rosters are short, working directly with event teams who were saying, actually, we're struggling in this way or that way, and then providing solutions, was the process we were going to take. Our feeling, having spoken to 1,000 event teams and ambassadors in one big chunk, and then multiple event teams and volunteers and ambassadors every single day as a team, as part of we do, and looking at our survey work and doing all the stuff we do, our feeling is that volunteers, and maybe your question is not exactly about getting volunteers, but we'd be overwhelmed with the number of volunteers. In terms of providing that support, so there were a few kind of literally what technically things could we do. So, for example, we've redeveloped the virtual volunteer to allow for auto uploading of people volunteering as timers and scanners into WebFMS, which really simplifies that process. We rewrote's probably a bit strong, but we developed the results processing system on a Saturday, expecting that a lot of people might be going home and processing rather than sitting in a cafe. And so you don't have the person in the corner who knows how to do it, and you can say, oh, I can't fix these results. So we developed our online real-time live support for results processing, and we're in the process of increasing the number of people supporting that line on a Saturday or Sunday if it was juniors, so that if you were sitting at home struggling with the results, you had much faster access to event support ambassadors who could help you to develop those results. I think, of course, there's the framework and the FAQs around that, and there's the direct support provided by the ambassadors and by the staff and by those processes. I think probably in a UK perspective, we needed the time to understand what the needs were so we could address those needs directly, and actually things changed so quickly that we never really got to that point.
Fair enough. And if you're thinking about PPE questions, of course, people are asking about personal protective equipment, and a question's coming up regarding it with hygiene in a second, so that will be addressed in just a moment. Kirsty Weston, co-event director, Upton House. What criteria are Parkrun HQ using to determine when a date can be set for Parkrun's return? Will core teams be canvassed ahead of this decision to ensure that there is sufficient cover to run the events, and how much notice will be given to event teams?
Yes, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to, there was a lot more in terms of the anecdotal stuff within the question, but I recognise there's a question to address.
Yeah, similar questions asked by David Hayday, I think, from Billericay, and David Murphy from Tees Barrage. So I think from the beginning, and I think it's the right thing to do, we've done a couple of things. We've said we are not going to, I mean, it's unobvious, but we like to state it, we are not going to go against public health guidelines in any local area, or risk doing that. And that's been we wanted to make that really clear from the start. So everywhere is that's a thing that we need. That's one of the things, the box we need to tick. At the same time, we've wanted to avoid saying things like when cases get to X, or when hospitals get to Y, or when a percentage of volunteers gets to A, or a intent to return gets to, like, we don't really want those trigger points. So the things we look at a number of things. So we're looking at as we've talked about it before, we've published some data on it before. I'm sure we'll publish data on it again, which is the runner intent to return, or the park runner intent to return, includes volunteers. So how likely are you to come this weekend, and how likely are you to come in 4 weeks' time? We ask a number of supplementary questions around that, around specific concerns. Are you worried about creating an infection in your community? Are you worried about getting it yourself? Are you worried about park runners being infected? And all of those kind of things. So we do quite a lot of survey work to understand runner intent. When we made the announcement, like I say, in England, that was at 80%, and in a definitely or likely return, and 7% in unlikely or definitely not going to return. I'm not going to say it's 87 or it's 95.5 or whatever it is, but I think probably we'd want I'm really not going to come back below 5%, but I'm not saying we wouldn't make a decision based on other factors if it was 10%. But that's one thing we look at really, really closely, and we measure that every week, and we'll continue doing so. So that's one criteria. Another criteria which we need is national government and national public health sign-off. So working with the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport England, if it's England, or other groups. So in Northern Ireland, the expert group on return to sport, for example. We have to have sign-off from those groups at national level. I think we need confidence that we can get landowners to give permissions. It's very, very difficult, to get, in England, 850 landowners, not being able to start until we've got written permission from 750 or 800 or 825 or whatever it might be, is difficult. We're trying to address that more centrally, and to a level we have to sometimes, as we attempted to do in September, say, look, we're thinking of coming back in October, and then that gave us the ability to say to, for example, National Trust, or who I have meetings with National Trust centrally, here's our framework. We'd like to come back in the end of October. How does it work for you? And they can say, it really couldn't work for us, or it'd be great, or something in the middle. And so there's some of that local stuff. I think the question, will core teams be canvassed ahead of this decision? It's very difficult to define a core team. So we canvass, we write to 20,000 park runners every single week. And that includes every level of park runner, from staff members to somebody who ran once 12 months ago. We think that's pretty representative. We speak to multiple event teams every single day. I think we may well go out to event teams again, which we did earlier this year, and write to every event team and say, would you like a call? And we spoke to about half of them last time, but half of them took us up on the offer. So actually, when we offer a call to event teams, we probably get half would take us up on that, which is great. We'd love them all to. That's actually quite a difficult process to do that properly. So I wouldn't say we would write to core teams and then put a vote and say, do we need 60% of core teams to say yes? Defining a core team is difficult. Putting a number of that is difficult. But we'll put all of those things in the pot, and ultimately it comes down to, obviously we're looking at infection levels in the community. What's the chance of somebody being at a park run with it? We're looking at evidence of transmission, which is developing all the time. We're making our own judgments on appropriateness. We're balancing risks against benefits. And we're putting all of those things into a pot and making our own decisions, and then try and publish as much of the evidence and justification behind it. And you'll see over the next months, and you've seen it already, New Zealand started and closed again. Some countries like England pencil in start and they're not. Some events like Australia, we're going state by state, and we're kind of making those decisions as we go.
Are we allowed? Am I going to get told off for saying what's happening today?
I don't know. Ask Russ. I'll ask him in the chat.
Russ, let us in the chat if we can address it, because of course I think it's a prime example as to how fluid and reactive you guys can be. So
we can talk about Poland. It's a really good point. Poland 2 weeks ago was all of those things were ticked. So 2-3 weeks ago, whenever it was, the intent to return was up close to 90%. The not coming back was I think 2 or 3%. Landowners were really excited. Landowners giving a position. Event teams were really excited. The government guidance allowed for a return, and cases and illness have been dropping significantly. So every single metric was in exactly the right place. We announced a return with a date, because actually the date was quite close and every metric was in the right place. And actually we had landowner permissions in place. It's a much smaller territory, so 75 events, not 850. Over the last 2 weeks, 2 weeks maybe, and we look at it every day, but over the last certainly week or two, things have taken a dramatic turn for the worse over the course of the week. We've had multiple meetings this week about what does that mean. We're meant to be starting tomorrow in Poland. What does that mean? What would cause us to change our mind? What is a knee-jerk reaction, and so on. And actually we got to the point yesterday afternoon, the Polish government had a press conference where they announced a series of restrictions. So certain parts of the country going into, a bit like in the UK's been, there's certain parts of the country going into higher restriction, certain other restrictions. But actually, the limit of events was 250 still. Loads of events, the large majority, I think 68 of 75 teams or something, maybe even more, had permission and wanted to go. So the large majority were good to go. The intent to return had dropped a little bit. We're still at something like 3/4 or 4/5 of Polish park runners wanted to come back. Legally, we still could. And actually, we had multiple meetings this week, culminating in a meeting this morning at 7 o'clock. We had expected the government actually to reduce the limit to make it impossible for us to come back anyway. They didn't do that. We had a meeting this morning at 7 o'clock with Jakob, who manages Poland for us, and a number of other people, and made the decision to postpone the reopening of Poland, despite the fact we actually technically still could. And so I think that is an important example of, and that news has gone out today.
Yeah, prime example. I was going to go live with the guys tomorrow, 7:30 in the morning, and of course got the message last night, and it was heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for the event director that I had to speak to regarding getting so close to that point and then having it taken away. Right.
And they are devastated. Like the Polish park run community are devastated. Really upset. And it's they agree it's the right thing to do. Clearly it's the right thing to do. But I think one of the issues for the whole pandemic has been we've been very quick to take things away in society in general. closing schools, whatever it might be, we've been quick to take things away without necessarily understanding the impact of taking something away. And that weighed really heavily on my mind when we closed parkrun in March, and all 22 countries in March. We were taking parkrun away, a lifeline for thousands of people. We did it. It's the right thing to do. And we see that again here in Poland. And it's the right thing to do. And we made the decision to do it. But actually, a lot of people are really, really sad about that. And, you know, we need to kind of be empathetic to that.
Yeah. And such a complexity. We had this early on. We said we all knew this, that it would be so complex to bring it back. And as is the case, as is so proven, you could close within 1 or 2 weeks, but bringing it back is taking months and months and months. Right. I promise you there's only a few more shorter questions. I've only got a few more pieces of paper left, and I will push Tom to try and keep it a bit more brief. Recognise this is burning into people's lunch hours too. April Hartley, run director at Eastville. Lovely Eastville that I went to New Year's Day last year. Again, another anecdote. I've been to Eastville. I don't think there's any event on there that I haven't been to apart from the new ones. Anyway, so would it be possible to have confirmation that as a run director, I would not be told to self-isolate for 2 weeks if any runner or volunteer test positive?
So yes and no. So we don't believe, from all the conversations we've had, we don't believe just because you're a run director and somebody at your event tested positive, you would because of only that information, you would be required to isolate. I can't promise that, because we're not in control of that process. Everybody who's following the track and trace process in the UK knows that it's fluid, shall we say, as a system, and we're not opening for weeks' time. So I can't promise that. The track and trace criteria, and I was listening to the president of the Glasgow Amateur Football Association on the radio the other day. He said he'd been told by track and tracers that even in a football game, now this may or may not be true, but he'd been told even in a football match, they wouldn't consider the contact between two players to be enough in an amateur football match. Now that may or not be right, but that's what he said he'd been told to constitute enough. Now, what I would say is, when the process is in the UK, when somebody tests positive in whatever environment, there is a tracking and tracing process that follows, and those tracking and tracing teams will say to the person that's tested positive, what have you done and where have you been and who have you been with? And you might have the app downloaded which talks about proximity, and there are fairly clear criteria. Have you been within 2 meters for 15 minutes, or have you had bodily contact, I think, or have you been within a meter for, I'm getting the edge of my knowledge here, 3 minutes or something. And if you fulfill those criteria, you may be asked to self-isolate. That isn't something we control. I don't believe you would be if you're the run director at Harrogate Juniors and one of the children tested positive. I don't think based on those facts alone you would be. That would be things that people would need to make their own mind up on, though, and take their own advice on.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul Fielding, the second most touristy tourist in all of parkrun world, is an event director at Basingstoke Juniors, and he says some ski resorts are being sued in a class action. It's alleged that they knowingly expose visitors to a risk of infection. If we operate, it might be argued that event teams are knowingly exposing people to a risk of infection, however small. Do event teams have any legal liability for this? If we do, does parkrun's insurance cover it?
So we've worked really, really closely with our insurers, who have been our insurers for, well, as long as I've been involved as a staff member, which is nearly 10 years. And we have a really close relationship with them, and they now insure, I think, every one of our events in the entire world, and across all the countries we operate in. And so we speak to them at the moment, most days, actually. Our public liability insurance, which is in play normal times and is in play now, covers our events for COVID-19 related situations. The insurance company are familiar with our framework. They're familiar with the volunteer hub. They approve the things we do. So absolutely, in the same way it would cover parkrun event teams in the event of negligence pre-COVID-19, it covers them now. And clearly we as a charity have a responsibility to go through the relevant sign-off. So let's say you're a local volunteer team, an event team. We're a registered charity. Let's say we've achieved sign-off from government, sign-off from National Public Health. We've Our framework's been approved by or they didn't really approve these things, but viewed by, submitted to our insurers. Our insurers are comfortable with it. Landowners given permission to use the land, and in most cases in the UK, that means local public health directors being given permission to use the land. As long as the teams are following the framework to the best of their ability, I don't. And even if they didn't and they made a mistake, they're covered by public liability insurance. That's what it's there for. But I just don't see how an event team could be considered negligent in that context.
If they're following due diligence, absolutely, and everything has been sent out in guidance and so forth. Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. Right, Alison Hogg, Event Director, Beeston. Will there be a national cut-off time, HQ direction for achieving a minimum number of volunteers each week before we have to cancel? Example, core roster completed by Friday lunchtime due to safety reasons. And it's similar also asked by Kevin Watson from Castle Park, Ian Pullen at Cycler Park, and Joe Scantlebury at Boddington Junior. So, of course, this is a long-standing thing about event teams having to do call-outs as well on top of this late toward the week. But is there going to be a national cut-off time regarding having a prerequisite amount?
Yeah, so I don't think so at this point in time. To give a little bit of context, we don't have a number of volunteers in normal times, but we do have some compulsory roles, whether it's tail walk or whether it's run director and the run director not doing something else and so on. We know that teams often, so our junior park run, we have a requirement at Harrogate Juniors for about 24 volunteers, I think it is, or something, for all the volunteer roles, and we have the requirement for the volunteers every 100 metres, I think it is, on the course. And we know that teams, and certainly our juniors near my house here, it does this, picks up a lot of volunteers on the day. So we might be 5 or 6 short going into the Sunday morning, and then we'll pick up 5 or 6. And we know it's really easy for us to do. We do it every week, and it's just not a problem. And you need that element of flexibility. And that's those are really, really important health and safety requirements. And we know that teams are able to manage that on the day. And we know that it works. And we have reports that show that it works and so on. In Australia, for junior parkrun, there is a difference, though, that all volunteers need to have a child safeguarding check in advance. That's quite a complex process and so on. So in Australia, junior parkrun, we do have a cut-off of the Thursday night. And if they haven't got all their volunteers in place by Thursday night for Australian juniors, they have to cancel on the Thursday night prior to the Sunday, because we can't have 50 kids turn up at a junior park run and not have the prerequisite number of safeguarding checked volunteers. And we need to know that on our system. So you can't just on an Australian junior park run on a Sunday go, well, I'll do it, because of the much higher requirement for people with safeguarding checks. Mm-hmm. Now that is really prohibitive, and it's a real challenge, and it kind of works a bit for 3 or 4 junior events with not so many people. It wouldn't work for 850 events, in my opinion. At the moment, we don't think, we don't think, based on all of the insight we have, that would be an issue. The teams in normal time need to fulfill a number of compulsory roles, and they pick up people on the day, and they do that, and that's fine. We have incredible compliance. Teams are incredible at doing that. As we talked about earlier, the number of people scanning, remember, a third of teams, in fact, Ross has popped in the comments, 32.8% of teams already have enough scanners already. So a third of teams don't even have to have a single extra volunteer in that sense. I would be amazed with all the virtual volunteer development we've done and the insight that we've done, and bearing in mind something like 95% of teams would be covered with just 3 or 4 or 5 extra people scanning, and they're the teams with 700 or 800 people, that you can't get those people to come forward at the end and do the scanning. So I don't foresee it at this point in time, based on all of the information we have to hand. I don't see lack of volunteers being a safety issue to the level that we need to put in cut-offs for having enough volunteers on the roster.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I've seen questions about it. People are going to have to wait. We have to wait and see. People are going to say the reassurances, and we won't know till it happens. And I think no matter what you say, of course, you've done your surveys, people are still going to say, and I've seen the questions about, like, we don't know, that's going to be the case.
I think a good example, Dave, just to briefly, and I promised I wouldn't go on, but when we had tail walkers, a lot of teams, not a lot's too strong, a number of volunteers felt that because we brought in this tail walker, we're going to encourage walkers, people were going to be here, volunteers were going to be there all day. Now, we were able to prove pretty conclusively in advance that was incredibly unlikely to happen, and then prove afterwards that it didn't happen, because we can show exactly the percentage of people who take longer than 45 minutes or an hour and a quarter, or whatever it might be. Yeah. I think the same goes here. We get incredible intent to return as volunteers, particularly from people who've never volunteered before. We know that the number of additional volunteers required is going to be actually incredibly small, and all of the insights suggest that's going to be the case. And as countries are opening up around the world, that's being supported. So we don't think at this point that'd be a problem. If we think it is, then we can make adjustments nearer the time.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think it's important to listen to the positive, quiet whispers that are out there, isn't it? In terms of, sometimes that's, as is the case, Tail Walker was the right move to do. And I think it was great. And it was extremely inclusive. It may be a small semantic, but it has a big impact and had a big impact. Right. Okay. Next thing. So we've come away from volunteer concerns. We finally got through that, but these are really quite short now, the other categories. Event independence. Noel Jones, event director, Great Denham. What do you, oh, by the way, Tom, guess what? I've been to Great Denham too. What do you do if Bedford and Millennium Country Park Run nearby do not open, since we cannot see us being able to cope with the influx of runners that this would likely create? So similar also by Joe Scanterbury again from Boddington Juniors and Alna Hassan from Tilgate. That's the question. Bushy doesn't happen. What happens to 1,500 people? Do they then spread out to the events nearby? So I think that's very much a concern for many people.
Yep, really good question. Another good question. Russ has just said, just a reminder that people can watch this whole thing from the start straight after this on our Facebook page and YouTube page. So if you're just tuning in now and you've missed the beginning, you can go back straight after this and watch it all. So that's kind of the same as in normal times. So we have 15 years of experience of events closing, big events being shut down for a week or a month or closing permanently, actually in some cases, and impact on other events. It's actually much slower typically than you think, much smaller typically than you think. The largest impact we've seen has been around things like New Year's Day doubles, where we've seen events, quadruple their record attendance. Obviously that's no more, and that is fairly exceptional. So actually in reality, we don't think that is something that would particularly materialize any more than normal times. I think at the same time, as we were returning, clearly there is a slightly different issue now than post-COVID, than pre-COVID, because of, for example, the need for scanning or the ability to social distance where possible and so on. I think part of that long build up into reopening, we gave it 8 or 9 weeks before without commitment, was to understand some of those things. And if we end up in a position where, for example, Bedford and Millennium Country Park Run are closed, for example, we can then address that with Great Denham, and it might be there's changes we can make to a course or support we can provide to an event team, or it might be that event would also need to be closed down. I don't see us reopening at a time when there are a significant number of events not reopening. Now, it might happen, and if we find we're moving towards that position, we can address that. But I think, as we sit here right now, likely many, many, many months away from reopening in the UK, and not having a full picture of what the UK will look like when we do reopen, with an assumption the UK will be in a drastically better position with regards to virus than it is today, I'd suggest we kind of kick that down the road a little bit in terms of understanding that question, although we do have, like I say, many years of experience of parkrun events closing temporarily or permanently, and the impact on their events. And actually, it is typically much lower than people think.
Yeah. I think it's the whole having to proact and react thing, isn't it? Exactly. You can only do so much that you proactively do, and then you have to react to things. We don't know how it's going to go, and being flexible as well wherever we can be. And I mean, I don't want to ask the question because everybody will be asking. It's like on a personal basis, when do you think it may come back? And of course, you could say something, but they'll pin it on. I don't answer the question because, of course, that is a question.
Okay.
If you do, because of course, if you say something, it'll be taken as verbatim. It'd be like, okay, you suggested this point, but of course, I mean,
look, let me address it. I'd quite like to address it. I don't mind addressing it. And if you'd asked me at the beginning of September, I'd have said I think it's really, really, really likely England's going to be back in October. Really likely, and of course we weren't. I think it was much less clear for the other home nations. Where we are now, we can also, and from a UK perspective, this is largely a UK call, we can see that today, the situation, it's not appropriate to open today, obviously. If it was this Saturday, that would be wrong for multiple reasons. and we can see the situation's getting worse, and it's going to get worse. Whether it gets worse a tiny bit or a lot before it gets better, we don't know, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think, personally, it's incredibly damaging for public health for things like parkrun to not be happening. And personally, and that doesn't mean I think it should open this weekend at all, but I don't think anybody would dispute the fact that whether it's even football crowds are really important for public health. I've got family in the northeast where it really is a religion for people in the northeast, and that being missing, not being able to go to watch Newcastle or Sunderland, for example, is a big thing. So I think that's really, really important, that we recognise that there is damage caused by keeping things like parkrun and group activities closed, and it might well be the right thing to do, but we need to recognise that damage. You would hope that whilst it's going to get worse, it doesn't get too much worse, and it doesn't get worse for too long, which would mean you would hope it's getting better, you would hope, by this side of Christmas. We don't really know. We don't know what seasonality it's going to have. We don't know what those things are going to do. But if you really push me on it, I would say I really, really hope we will be back in the spring in full. I really do hope that. And I don't mind, like, if we're not, I don't mind it if people say, well, you thought we were back in the spring and you're not. I'm making an educated guess. I'm in a fortunate position of being able to make a really educated guess. And I probably.
How long is a piece of string? How long is a piece of string, Tom? It's the same question ultimately. You can't.
Sooner. I wouldn't rule out sooner.
Yeah.
It could be much later. I wouldn't rule out much later.
Mm-hmm.
I'm as I sit here today, I'm really hopeful that the United Kingdom will be in a place by the spring where we can come back in full. I could be completely wrong. That is my hope, and what I think will happen. If you've pushed me to say what if I had to say something, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's the thing. You may be right, may be wrong, but there shouldn't be any shame in regarding it. A lot of people end up saying that you said this and this. Like, you know what? We have to react. Nobody knows the future. Right. So last couple of bits, as a matter of fact, and then I think we won't be far from tying this up. So the hygiene section, which I think was touched on a little bit earlier, but this is a bit more towards, I guess, the team safety and increased responsibilities. So Deborah Roback, event director, Highbury Fields. Guess what, Tom? Regarding volunteers, volunteer team safety and increased responsibilities are an issue. For example, washing Highbury's bibs, cleaning finish tokens, and the storage of and cleaning of equipment, finish funnel and tape, for example, is a concern. Added to this, will volunteers be asked to wear disposable gloves and masks? What is the mask policy?
Okay, so very quickly, I think that's quite simple to answer. Mm-hmm. At the time, we were working with government around the framework. Our initial proposal there was that things like bibs, lanyards, tokens could be quarantined for a period of time. So people drop them in a bucket or a bag, and then they're not touched for a period of time for a few days, and then they're quarantined and they're kind of safe and they can be used again. At the time, the guidance was that they needed to be washed, and so at that time, we felt that was an appropriate compromise to make, and we accept. So when you're going through these kind of negotiations, can you do this? No. Can you do this? Yes. Can you do this? Maybe. We felt that was appropriate, and actually, the teams that have reopened under the framework have been doing that. And I know that our team in Australia have been washing a set of tokens every day and seeing what happens to them for about the last 2 months. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the feedback, once the framework was published, the feedback in England, particularly where we were looking to coming back, where the teams we've got a lot of big teams and a lot of old teams in terms of the tokens, so a lot of worn tokens with sellotape on, and teams with more volunteers, 50, 60 volunteers, so volunteer bibs and lanyards, all those things, were that washing would be operationally challenging for them, would be difficult. At no point would we be in a position where parkrun volunteers should be incurring a cost. So if there were costs associated with that, then we would implement a process to reimburse those. Over those 6 to 8 weeks, I think based on the feedback from the volunteer teams, we would have been looking to go back and see if we can actually go back to a position where some of that hardware can be quarantined for a period of time rather than washed and cleaned. We would only do that if we could get public health to sign off on that. appropriately. Now, with the delay in reopening, it's not been a problem in the other countries. Again, the events are smaller and they're newer and so on, typically. With the delay in the reopening, and obviously with people like the Deputy Chief Medical Officer or Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport being otherwise caught up in what are, for obvious reasons, more important things than parkrun right now, we're not pushing for that. If we had to push for it now, we'd have to go with the washing. Evidence is changing all the time. Understanding is changing all the time. Science's view on things is changing all the time. So I would leave that open to actually, with regards to the UK, we may or may not need to wash them. Quarantining may be enough. And as we get clarity on that, remembering we're months away from reopening, we'll update that accordingly. The masks and gloves, I would say the same. At the time in the framework, the evidence, there was no real evidence that in a setting such as parkrun, masks and gloves would make a material difference to the safety of people. Clearly, we would ban people from wearing them. Providing them is a logistical challenge for us. We talked through that at length at national public health and government level, and everybody agreed that they weren't a requirement at that time for parkrun. When we come back, the world might have changed, and they might be. I don't know, but at the time, and certainly for what we're aware of now, the evidence of their benefit. Remember, we're putting it in the context of, when we made the announcement, it was 1 in 2,000 people were infected. So it might be that, it might be 1 in 4,000 when we come back, it might be 1 in 1,000, whatever it is. But remember, it's not in the context of where we are today. So that might change. At the moment, then we wouldn't, at the moment, based on the evidence and the advice we've been given and our own views, we would not mandate masks or gloves. We wouldn't provide them for event teams, but if event teams wanted to use them, they would be welcome to.
Okay, fair enough. All right, and then this is the last category we have now. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Russ has been putting the questions up in the comments, so he's been pinning them up there so the questions are there for people to see. I'm going to throw you a curveball now, Russ, because I'm going to combine these two, because one of them, which I'll read first, from Peter Scott, event director in Norwich. I haven't been to Norwich, Tom. It's the one I haven't been to.
I have.
Yeah, see, you got one over on me. And then I'll read this because it's less of a question, but more a kind of a summary feeling. But then it proceeds nicely into Chris Raveney, event director, Burgess Parkrun's question. Burgess Parkrun, I have. You and I have both done Burgess Parkrun together, as a matter of fact, just before the London Marathon. There you go. Walk down memory lane. Shut up, Danny and Karen, asking the question people are saying right now. So Peter Scott says, I understand your frustration that the evidence seems to point to low transmission risks outdoors and that the benefits of participating in parkrun outweigh COVID risks. However, would you agree that we have to take account of public perception and the behavioural science alongside the medical science? It would be very difficult to justify 500 people thundering around a fairly confined park while a group of 7 people are being told they can't have a picnic in the same park. We risk losing the community support that parkrun has so carefully built up over the years if we get this wrong. And then Chris's question says, the perception of parkrun is almost universally positive in our community and indeed nationally. What impact does HQ think restarting before the local non-parkrunning community is ready may have on this wider perception? How damaging could this be? And has thought been given on how to potential conflict situation for RDs and members of the public who don't think the event should be going ahead? So how do you deal with the potential conflict that may arise? And this was asked a lot. Similar question by Mark Weston from Bestwood Village, Claire Crook from Bedfont, David Murphy, Tees Barrage, Andy Jubb, Eastville, Sophie McKay, Wimbledon, Anna Harrington for Watermeadows, Kerry Green from Gloucester North, John Jack, Preston Park. This is, I think, one of the biggest concerns of most people.
Yeah, and I really understand that, and if I didn't list it in the things when we were talking earlier about the what are the things, the metrics we might look at when restarting an event, if I didn't mention it then I should have done it. It's something we look at really, really closely, and it is really, really important to us. And I completely agree with what Peter Scott is saying there from Norwich around it'd be very difficult to justify 500 people thundering around a fairly confined park. And Norwich is a good example. It's a really big park run in terms of numbers, but it's a multi-lapper on quite confined park in a very high-profile park. So it's a bit like my local one. The one I helped start, Woodhouse Moor, which is 700 people on a 3-lapper in a kind of not quite city centre, but sort of city centre park. Yeah. It's really important to us. When we were looking, so the short answer is yes, we'll absolutely look at that all the time, and it's really important to us. When we were looking at the reopening in England, we were looking at things coming back. So there were various sports coming back, and they were all going down really positively. So we were seeing very little public outrage at things coming back. And in fact, that's largely continued, actually. I mean, we seem to be quite selective about the things we get outraged about, but largely when things have come back, sporting events, sporting stuff has come back, there's been relatively little outrage. When we made the decision to come back, schools were due to come back, universities were due to come back, and football crowds were due to come back before we came back. And part of our feeling was that those sort of things, and many other things like them, would make human gatherings much more acceptable. You know, the primary school my kids go to has, 500 people, in teachers and pupils. The local grammar school on the corner from where our house is has, I think, 2,000 pupils. The football grounds have thousands of people. In the universities, Leeds University has Leeds Universities combined, Leeds Met and Leeds Uni, I think about 100,000 people coming into the city. And at that point in the beginning of September, it looked like our reading was people getting more and more comfortable. Remember, the rule of six wasn't a thing then. And all of these things were going to happen to move that further along. And so we were observing those prior to making a decision as to whether or not we did come back. Clearly, none of those things really went smoothly. Some of them didn't happen at all. And that was one of the many things that fed into our decision not to return. Interestingly, the rule of six, and I think you refer to it there, made an incredible difference to perception. So we went from announcing a reopening, I think on the Monday, was the most positive thing we've ever seen. All over the place, people hang out brilliant cities, non-park runners, park runners, everybody we could think of was really excited. The following day, I think it was the Tuesday, the rule of six was announced, and we got absolutely bombarded under an avalanche of concerns from all kinds of parts of the community, even though that didn't apply to us. Now, I completely understand why people would be frustrated about that, and I agree with their frustrations, and I agree it would be insensitive for 500 people to thunder around Eaton Park in Norwich whilst a family can't go for a picnic. So I totally agree with all of that. But at that time when we made the decision, I feel like I'm probably maybe trying too hard to justify the decision we made in September, but I'm trying to use it as context for these answers. Those were at the front of our mind at the time of reopening. We feel it would have been accepted, and things were getting better. Then things got worse. So clearly, right now, it would be unacceptable, and we wouldn't reopen. And when we made the decision to not reopen, legally we could still reopen. So we made the decision not to push forward to the reopening in England. Now, loads of local landowners would have said no, but technically we could still move forward. We made that decision not to, based on multiple factors, and that was absolutely one of them. So that public perception was absolutely one of them. I think going forward, that will continue to be a really, really, really fundamental piece of the jigsaw. At the same time, we have to be careful not to not come back on principle, because these people can't do this in this context, and that's not fair if we can do what we're going. So we're not going to come back until the whole world is fair and all of the rules and regulations are fair and there's parity in this. So otherwise, we'll just be the last ones coming back, and where we think we've got one of the most to offer in terms of public health and one of the lowest risks in terms of public health. But absolutely, I totally agree with everything you say there, Peter. I think the question from Chris and everybody else is really, really important. It's at the front of our minds all the time, and will continue to be all of our time. I guess the final thing is that there will always be a situation where there's conflict in parks. Mm-hmm. When we open, 1,200 UK events or whatever it is, there will, whatever situation the country is in, as there was before COVID, there will be periods of conflict instances of conflict between non-park runners and park runners. We always provide, I believe, really, really, really good support really close support to event teams when they get in that situation. And we have all kinds of weird and wonderful things. If you had access to our incident system like I do, you'd see them. All kinds of weird and wonderful things happen.
Yeah.
We try and support events as best we can on a case-by-case basis. I'm sure whenever we come back, there will be instances, and I think of it myself, of our juniors in the park and the residents walking through the park, and there's going to be a resident. When we started Junior Park Run, there was a guy that ran through the park every single Sunday over our cones. Yeah. He was furious we were there, and it took us about 2 years to win him over. There will be that relating to COVID, where some people think you shouldn't be in the park because a gathering of people is not appropriate, and that will happen whenever we decide to come back, and we'll provide event team support in that. And that's largely, the conversation this morning about Poland. We had all of those things in place. We had permissions. It was legal. We've got insurance. The volunteers wanted to do it. The large majority of park runners wanted to come back. The fundamental part of our conversation this morning, 7 o'clock this morning, was it'll just be really insensitive. If we look at everything, it'll be really insensitive. And so we pulled that with 24 hours notice, 75 event teams and 6,000 people probably were going to go tomorrow based on exactly that. So hopefully that's a demonstration that we are mindful of that.
Yeah, I know I meant to be sort of devil's advocate and questioning that, but no, I think I agree, because the comments, a lot of people were saying that they were worried about the public perception. That was a big thing that resonated through in the comments. And there is the thing that, as you say there, it's the perception. And I have to give credit to you and Parkrun, again, just trying not to make sure that I'm not just blowing smoke, that you have really taken great strides and concerns regarding that. You've basically said, right, we're not going to push ahead. You've taken a lot of flack about different things. You've turned the other cheek, and you're really trying to position yourself to be something that is really taking into as many concerns for people as possible, trying to be as broad ranging. And that's the thing, you have no intention to cause anger or upset. And I can see in the reactions and emojis that no matter how much clarity you may give, there's still going to be some people that may not agree. They may be quite angry, and they may not ever shift in that position because it's never going to align. But there has to be credit given to you guys at Parkrun HQ that you are trying your best, that you are being as open and as transparent as possible. You are spending your time, like now, to try and explain things in great detail. There's no hiding about any of this. And also making sure that you try and, again, you're protecting everybody. And it be the volunteers are trying to protect them, be it the mental health of people, and protecting the reputation of Parkrun, the brand itself. So forgive me for saying this, but I think it needs to be said. And it's a concern that we all share and have, and we're all very passionate about it. So,
look, yeah. I think that's the thing, Danny. I think when you sit in the middle of something that's so important to so many people, and so many people have put so much of their heart and soul into it, that you have to get as much information as you can, take as many things into account as you can. You have to make decisions based on evidence, and you have to publish that evidence and show this is why we're making this decision. This is the justification. But you have to make decisions knowing that whatever decision you make, a percentage of people are going to be really, really unhappy with it. And that, unfortunately, that's the reality of it. You can't always make the decisions with the majority. So you have to balance everybody's views in an interesting way, because the minority can often be much more important than the majority. But sometimes it's the other way around, and you have to try and make those decisions. And we try our best to make those decisions and be as transparent as we can.
It's a seesaw, isn't it? Trying to balance it all up. Yeah, absolutely. I just want to give a couple of shout outs, because of course I gave credit to Russ, but apparently Kirsty and Callum, the new boy, Callum, I believe, he's there sitting there watching, and there's been a team effort regarding keeping tabs on all the comments and things. Thank you very much. I noticed a comment, I think it's Andrew Welch from Boston Parkrun. Could you turn around and give us a tinkle on the old ivories on the piano behind, he says.
I wish I could. But I can't really play it. It's my mum. My mum was a music teacher, and it was my mum's piano. And our daughter Rosie is trying to learn the piano, and so Rosie plays it. But yeah, I'm afraid it would not be. I've got a New Year's resolution to maybe try and learn the piano, but I don't know if I'll be biting off more than I could chew there.
Yeah. Can I ask you a very quick question? And you've addressed this before, and I keep it a bit brief because then we'll tie it up. I keep seeing the comments about chips and timing mats. And I know you've answered this question before. It would dissolve the community element of Parkrun, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so I'm not looking at the comments, so I don't know what they are, but I think it's a nice piece to end it on, to be honest. I think what do we believe in at Parkrun, and why is Parkrun successful, and what have we learned over 16 years? And fundamental to that is human interaction. And I think that's why I feel generally that the damage caused by preventing human interaction is profound to society in many ways, and is not being taken into account. So it's currently against the law for my wife to have a cup of tea with her mum in their garden. And I think that may be right. I'm not saying that's wrong, but what I'm saying is we seem to be saying socializing is banned here without really understanding, I don't believe, or being empathetic to the importance to human beings as animals of social interaction. And Parkrun is successful because of that. Parkrun is successful because it enables real human interaction. And when people are always saying, how about timing? For 15 years they said, what about timing chips and timing mats and so on? It would remove human interaction. You cross you start and somebody goes 3, 2, 1, go. It's a wonderful thing. We love hearing that noise and the encouragement and all those kind of things, and a human doing that. Then at the end, there's somebody stood at the finish line and they time you across the line. They go, well done. They might your name, they might not. They take your time, they're feeling engaged with you. Then somebody gives you a token, and at the end somebody scans it, and there's this enforced human interaction, and then people sort those tokens at the end, and that's really, really important, and people come together. And as long as I have a say in how Parkrun operates, we will do everything we can to maximize real human in-person interaction. And at this point in time, we will fight for that to come back when it's appropriate to do so. Some people might say, yeah, but you could come back sooner if you brought chip timing in of some sort. Now actually, I really worry about setting precedents that you can't undo.
Yeah.
So I really worry about actually you engineer out human interaction and then it's gone forever.
Yeah.
Aside from
be careful what you wish for. Be very careful what you wish for. Yeah.
Exactly right. And I think, I feel so passionate about it that human interaction, socializing from human to human in real space, in person, is so vitally important. And so we will always do everything we can with the Parkrun operating model, the way our events are delivered, to increase the requirement for volunteering and human contact. And I hope in 10 years' time, we currently average about 20 volunteers per event. I hope in 10 years' time, we're at 40 volunteers per event, 50, and we get people involved in that way.
Yeah, no, fair enough. All right, I'm going to leave this up here. Janice Clement, all credit to Parkrun HQ for trying to do the right thing. Love you. That's very kind of you. Very lovely comment. And Mum and Dad, if you're watching, I'd like yourself, Tom, with all your family people involved, and my Mum and Dad will be watching. Hang on in there. These are guys that have been sitting there waiting, vulnerable for 7 months, waiting, desperate for Parkrun to come back, and it's a staple part of their week. But hang on in there. We're all in this together. Everybody has a lot of love and positivity for your time and appreciation. So thank you very much, guys. Thank you to everybody that's watched. Shall we wind it up and end the broadcast here?
Yeah.
And thank you for the time. 1 hour 45. That's nearly an hour, Tom. It's nearly an hour. In Tom World, that's an hour. So we've done
one.
That's for the one, exactly. We're in that hour zone, just edging toward 2. But thank you for affording us your time, guys. As Tom said earlier, this is going to be online afterwards. If you've missed anything, it's going to be on YouTube and Facebook permanently if you ever need to go and go back and listen again. So love to you all. Thank you. Have a great parkrun weekend wherever it is you may be. Not parkrunning. Don't forget to not parkrun and log your not parkruns too. I forgot a couple of weeks ago and got told off. But otherwise, have a fantastic weekend. Thank you for your time, Tom. Thanks to everybody in the background.
We will be back.
Yeah, and thank you to all the ambassadors, for everybody for the questions, and the ambassadors who compiled it and helped us make this happen too. So all the very best, and we'll say ta-ta. Right, have a good weekend, everyone.